Good day, my Janeites. I am the Austen Reviewer. Today we're going to look at one of the oddly infamous but somewhat good adaptations, though there's some argument about that, versions of Sense and Sensibility, 2007 by the BBC. It's a short mini-series kind of idea, as most of the ones from that particular year are, so we'll quickly go over the synopsis. So we start with the fireplace scene of a man seducing a woman. We then cut to Mr. John Dashwood arriving at Norland, where he has come to see his father, who is dying and passing away. His father makes him promise that he will provide for his half-sisters. He agrees to, of course. The father dies. John Dashwood is then talked out of giving any assistance to his sisters very gradually by his wife, who's very jealous. We'll get into her later, of course. And as soon as he is dead, pretty much on the wife's prompting, they go to Norland, where they are now the owners of the house. Marianne is very displeased about this. She is very sensitive and gives feelings a lot of more bearing in the strength of any conversation that she's in. So she's very unhappy about this. She insults Fanny, and Fanny's insulting them. That's Mrs. John Dashwood. I suppose I should say that. But so they're doing that, very unhappy. Then Fanny's brother, Mr. Edward Ferrars, arrives. He and Eleanor take a liking to each other. They have some conversations and stuff. They're showing mutual kind of affection for each other. Fanny sees this, is very displeased, gives the mother some hints that this is not going to work well. Up until this point, Mrs. Dashwood had been putting off getting a new place. She had looked at some, but was always looking at things that were much too expensive. But after this insult, her feelings are aroused. She takes the first good offer that she gets, which is for a cottage in Barton with her cousin owns the estate there. So they agree to it. Within the space of a week, off they go. They arrive there. It's a little tiny cottage by the sea. There's this decrepit old piano. There's no furniture inside of it. There's tiny little bedrooms and stuff. There's nobody to light fires. They have 2 servants, but they didn't send them ahead or anything. Sir John comes to visit, brings them some stuff, demands they come to his estate that night to have a meal. So they get there, they meet Colonel Brandon and some other people. Marianne plays. Colonel Brandon is the only one that really shows, aside from her sister and her mother, any understanding of music and behavior she can appreciate. So she respects his opinion on music, but for the rest of it, she doesn't think he's that interesting of a person. He calls the next day bringing music for Marianne to have. People start to suspect that he's got some affection for her, while also teasing Eleanor about, "Mambo, stop bothering me," her bow that she left behind. They're teasing Eleanor about the bow that she left behind, that they don't actually know who it is, but they're very happy to tease her about it anyway. So people are talking about how they are expecting Marianne and Colonel Brandon to be together. Eleanor brings this up with Marianne, who decries that he's way too old. When she sees that he's going to call one day, she grabs her younger sister and they go out running in the rain. She falls down a hill, sprains her ankle. Mr. Willoughby happens by, picks her up, brings her back to their cottage. She's basically instantly in love with him. Next day, Sir John comes. They ask him about Willoughby. They hear what little information he has about him. Willoughby comes, brings strawberries for Marianne, and they talk about poetry and stuff and all this bonding, and they're fast and deeply in love with each other. The next thing we have is a little ball that they have going on. Marianne's the only one wearing gloves, but we'll get into that later on when we're talking about the quality of the movie and the adaptation side. It's very obvious that she prefers Willoughby. Brandon confronts Willoughby about this. Willoughby responds in very much something of a cad way, that he can't do anything about it and it's not his business and he won't listen to him anyway. And Willoughby gives Marianne a horse. Eleanor points out that they can't accept it. Marianne's upset by this. Willoughby takes the horse back to his place but says that it's Marianne's whenever she decides that she wants it. Eleanor then talks to Marianne about how her behavior is causing her to appear to everybody Sir John and Brandon talk a bit while they're out shooting. Brandon then tries a little harder to gain Marianne's affection, even though he's pretty much lost hope at this point. So he has them all come, he's going to take them to go for a picnic. But he is called off by a letter arriving that he cannot put off. Willoughby and and Marianne are particularly upset by this. They all decide they're going to go driving in the country. Willoughby takes Marianne, and away they go, and nobody knows where they went. They go to Allenham, which is where Willoughby is eventually going to inherit. His aunt lives there. He doesn't actually have much of any money of his own, so he's dependent on her goodwill. She's not there at the time. They look over the house. He kisses her, probably thinks about doing something else, but they decide to go back. They then are at a dinner where everyone finds out that they know where they went already, and they tease them mercilessly about that as well. Eleanor again confronts Marianne about the impropriety of her actions. Then she and her mother have a talk about them and speculate about their engagement, which they haven't been told of, but they're very strongly suspicious of. Willoughby then asks if he can talk to Marianne privately the next day, so they let her do that. They go out for a walk, but when they return, Marianne is in tears and inconsolable. Willoughby says that he's being sent to London on business and he doesn't know when he's going to get to come back, and he's very upset, so off he goes. Eleanor and her mother argue about whether she should try to invite Edward to come and see them, because they had given him an invitation but he hadn't come. And then, wouldn't you know it, the next day he does arrive, but he's in very low spirits and he's kind of upset. He had just been visiting some other friends and was passing through, but he can't stay very long. And eventually he leaves as well. So you do see some hair on a ring, though, that he has, which is kind of suspicious. They all think that it's Eleanor's, but she doesn't know when on earth he would have possibly gotten it. Next, they are visited by Mr. and Mrs. Palmer and the Miss Steeles, who are now in town. The Miss Steeles are rather silly and kind of flattering and not a whole lot of obvious substance. Under the cover, or while going out walking, Lucy Steele informs Eleanor that she is actually engaged to Edward and has been for years. She talks about how it's hard on her and all this kind of stuff, but we'll get into that later. They then find out that Mrs. Jennings is planning on going to London and wants to take the Miss Dashwoods with her. Eleanor's not so sure about it. Marianne is very excited to go because Willoughby is there, so she eventually accepts. Marianne writes and sends a letter to Willoughby the moment they arrive in London, basically, and then every time they go out or come back, she's always asking about letters. She also avoids Colonel Brandon like the plague when he arrives to come and visit them. They then go to an assembly where they meet Fanny and Mr. Robert Ferris, which is Edward's younger brother, and a bit of a fop, but well, he doesn't actually play that much into the story. But Marianne sees Willoughby from across the room and goes up to him, and she's all excited to see him, but he's very cold to her. She doesn't understand why. She faints but is caught by Colonel Brandon. They get home. She furiously writes another letter and sends it out. You then see a scene of Willoughby and Brandon having a duel. Marianne progressively starts slowly starving herself and looking in very poor looks. She finally gets a package from Willoughby that contains all of her letters that she had sent to him and a lock of her hair. And then they get the news from Mrs. Jennings, who had just gone out, that she had just found out that Mr. Willoughby is getting married to a very rich woman, basically immediately. Marianne's heart is broken. Brandon then reveals that it was Willoughby that had been the ultimate cause of his going away, I guess spoilers, because he had seduced the godchild, basically, or the ward of Colonel Brandon, and gotten her pregnant, and he had just been found laid up in the kid and no support whatsoever. This was also found out by Willoughby's aunt, who threatened to cut him off, and that's why he ran off quickly to find a rich woman, because he figured he couldn't live without money. They send a letter to their mother, but she declines to have them come home because she figures that that'll just everything there will remind Marianne of Willoughby, and that will be even worse. John then visits and informs Eleanor that the Mrs. Ferris has her eyes on a very rich young lady named Miss Morton for Edward, but also advises her that she should try to get Colonel Brandon because he's a very upstanding and very rich man. He also thinks that Marianne has completely and totally lost her looks. John also thinks that he should invite his sisters over to their house to stay for a while, to be more like a good relative should. In order to subvert this, though, Fanny invites the Miss Steeles to come and stay, which gives Lucy a lot of hope because she thinks she's getting preferential treatment here. Fanny Dashwood is then gossiping about Marianne and her behavior with Willoughby and what people are saying about it and this, that, and another thing. Lucy then goes to visit with Eleanor, mostly to gush and brag about how well she's doing with Edward's family. Edward then arrives, wants to talk to Eleanor, but she pushes him off onto Lucy because she figures that's probably the more proper thing for them to be doing in that particular case, and leaves quite upset. While they are there, however, and they decide to walk back together because she was planning to go home there anyway, Anne slips, who is the other Miss Steele, and tells Mrs. Ferris and Fanny about the engagement. They are furious about this, and when they arrive, the mother threatens to disinherit Edward if he doesn't break off the engagement. He chooses not to. He then have to go out on the street. John goes to inform this about all this. He also hints to Eleanor that between her or Lucy Steele, they would have preferred that it had been her, but Eleanor then gets a message, or is told by Colonel Brandon, so she gets a message to Edward that Colonel Brandon is offering him a living if he wants to take orders to become a minister, and then him and Lucy can get married. So they do that. They then go off to visit the Palmers and meet Miss Palmer's baby. Marianne goes out reminiscing about Willoughby and wandering around in the rain. She gets sick. Colonel Brandon has to bring her back, but she's got a terrible fever. It's infectious, and the doctors are very concerned about her. So they think she's going to die, but she manages to get over it, but not before her mother is sent for by Colonel Brandon. While she's in the recovery phase, Mr. Willoughby comes in. Well, he comes anyway, to the house and tells Eleanor his side of the story, that he really did love Marianne and that he had panicked, and the only reason why he was actually planning to propose to her, and the only reason he didn't was because the scandal blew up, and he kind of blames himself for it, and that he didn't want to break Marianne's heart, and the returning of the letters and stuff was actually done by his wife, who knew full well that he didn't love her when he married her, so it's kind of on both of them. They're one of the worst couples in all of Austendom. But anyway, Mrs. Dashwood arrives about at this point, finds Marianne doing better. They go back to Barton College. Marianne starts to feel for Colonel Brandon. They hear that Lucy Steele is married from one of their servants who happened to see her. They then get a visit from Edward. They try to congratulate him on his marriage, but he reveals that Lucy married Robert, his brother, basically as soon as he was disinherited because she was in it for the money, and then he wants to propose to Eleanor. And they then both get married, and that's the end. Now, the most, let's get the visuals of the movie out of the way. It did a very good job. Again, you're dealing with kind of a muted kind of color scheme there by the ocean in this little ditch valley kind of a thing with nothing visible from miles around as far as you can tell. They're very isolated, which plays really into the visuals of that they are so isolated. They don't have family that's willing to step up to help them, really, on the Dashwood side at least. So the visuals of that really plays into the whole isolation that they feel. It's very visually represented. The barren house that they come to, the warm welcome by the people, but the people are also kind of silly, and they're not entirely sure that they're really that good of a company, but they're good enough and they're friendly enough, so that all works out. The wardrobe is again quite muted, though it does get a lot brighter when you get with Marianne falling in love with Mr. Willoughby. The locations they use were beautiful. A lot of the costumes were really nice. The hair and effects and stuff is pretty practical to the time. Yeah, it's a very pretty movie. It's well put together. You get the stories well communicated, and the feelings of the characters come through pretty good. The dialogue doesn't sound like it was plucked out of the wrong century or something. Though there's quite a number of people that have accents, but I don't think the accents really seem to fit very well with where the characters are supposedly from. And granted, I'm not very good with accents, but they've got this character that's from Devonshire, and they sound, to my ears at least, like they're doing a Scottish accent. Which, I don't know why they did that, but they did. But I suppose it's one way of showing that they're country bumpkins or something. But yeah, I don't quite understand that decision. But yeah, it did a pretty good job overall. We'll get to the scores later, but yeah, they did pretty well overall. I mean, it's not till you get to the other part that you actually start to wonder what the hell they were thinking. So we'll do that now. So as an adaptation, this one gets usually something of a sideways look from a lot of Janeites because of the opening, mostly. A lot of the rest of it is really good. It's very nitpicky, things that I kind of have to say about the rest of it. But this particular one, the opening. They open with a scene, they don't show you the face, but you hear his voice, of Willoughby seducing Eliza. Now that happens. We know that happens. But it's only alluded to in the book, and you don't hear anything about how he did it or when he did it or any of this stuff. You only know that he did it at some point in time. But it creates a problem because you then, when he comes on screen and you hear his voice and the way they had the character, the actor portray him, you don't trust him. You know there's something wrong with this. Even if you're not familiar with the story, you're like, someone's being seduced. Who is it? What are the consequences going to be? Because it's a major taboo for that time. And that really undermines Willoughby's character, because that really is something of the greatest plot twist in the book, because he genuinely loves Marianne. He wants to marry Marianne. Maybe he didn't exactly start out with that aim, but that's what it came to very quickly. So starting in this way where you're suspicious of any and every male character that comes on screen, and then especially the way they portray him, you think he's a douchebag. You're pretty sure that he's just in this for what he can get out of it. And the only time you really get any sort of a hint that maybe there's something else there is when he takes her to Allenham and she kisses him, and you get the distinct impression that probably if he had pushed the envelope a little bit, she would have done something. But you can see the conscience coming across his face that no, this is not right, we shouldn't do this. And he does take something of responsibility for it when they get to the dinner at night. And the way it's acted does seem like he's taking some responsibility for it, though you could also say that he's just trying to brush it off and excuse his own behavior. And that is really close to the point in time where they have him about to propose, and I just don't read the book like that. He must have been that really frustrates a lot of Jane Austen fans when they're watching this, because this character you don't trust. You realize later on in the book, in the context of the book, that you maybe shouldn't trust him, but all of his actions inside of the book, from the time where he meets Marianne up until up until the point where he gets excommunicated by his aunt, basically, he's acting in a way that we would consider more or less honorable. The behavior of him and Marianne, the two of them together, is a little bit bordering on scandalous, and it's getting people to talk, which is what Eleanor objects to. But you don't look at him in the story and think, well, he's just a cad. Whereas that's very much the impression that I kind of get from the movie. The other thing that they did in this, which drives me crazy because they do it in so many of the adaptations, is they completely changed Edward Ferras's character. I mean, he's probably, aside from Fanny Price, he's the one where this happens to the most, because he's very soft-spoken. He's not really remarkable. He's intelligent, but he's really quiet. He's not out of his way to express stuff. He's not going out of his way to be dashing and all this kind of stuff. He's not what you'd think of as your classic romance hero. And really that is kind of the thing with this book. Willoughby kind of represents the guy you date, and Colonel Brandon or Edward more represent the guy you marry. So when they change his character so completely, yes, he's charming, yes, he's sparkly, yes, he's very easy for a modern audience to like, but he's no longer the same Edward Ferrars character from the novel. The other one that they were pretty subtle with it, but I think that they actually lost something with being so subtle, was with Lucy Steele. She's extremely shrewd. She's not intelligent, but she is smart. She attaches Edward before he's really had much opportunity to meet other women, and she uses the fact that men can't socially easily break off engagements without serious social repercussions to her advantage of keeping him engaged to her for years and years, even beyond his feelings dying and him meeting a superior woman for him in Eleanor. This is the whole point of... That's the whole point of why she tells Eleanor, because she's heard of her from him. And this is one of those kind of things that's slightly maddening, because she reveals her engagement to Edward to put Eleanor off, to test her reactions. And even, I'd say, in some respects, to torture her. Eleanor's very good at containing her feelings. We're not exactly sure how shrewd Lucy is with detecting other people's feelings. We do know, based on her behavior and some of Eleanor's thoughts on the matter, that Lucy doesn't really love Edward that much, and he certainly doesn't love her anymore, but they're still in this engagement because Lucy refuses to break it off. Edward is an honorable man, so he won't, or in his mind just about he can't break it off. So there's this dynamic in there that's, I mean, if they had ended up getting married, it would have been one of like the ultimate tragedies of for people's happiness. Okay, but let's get into some of my more specific comments. I had rented out a bunch of these movies from the library, and when did I watch this? I watched this, I think 2 months ago, because I did the one review, and then I watched this at the same time that I watched The Bride and Prejudice. So all my notes are from them. So I had read the book recently when I did the watch, but I haven't read it this recently. But anyway, so we'll go into a couple of the more blatant things. I freaked out, of course, about the initial, not quite sex scene, but the seduction scene. I had been warned about it in a very subtle way by one of my fellow Janeites that lives in the community I'm in. She's actually an author. She writes Jane Austen-inspired era fiction, as well as she wrote a prequel to Pride and Prejudice, which is pretty good. I'll probably review that at some point in time. But anyway, we were going to see a live play production of Sense and Sensibility, which I'll probably review that at some point in time too. But anyway, and she asked me how many of the versions I had seen, and I'd seen most of them. She asked, have you seen the 2007 one? And I was like, I'm not sure. What's kind of the defining attributes of it? And she kind of, you could see it brought her pain to say it, and she's like, they reveal the plot twist at the very start of the thing. And there's a couple of kind of plot twists in Sense and Sensibility. The biggest one that has the most impact on the overall plot is, of course, Willoughby having seduced this woman before and her having given birth to a child. The secondary one is, of course, at the very, very end, that Lucy doesn't marry Edward. But the only one that could really give you that big of a reaction, unless they are doing some kind of flashback thing for the entirety of the movie, would be the Willoughby thing. So that was somewhat intriguing. From the look of things, I did a 2007 Persuasion. I know there's a 2007 Emma, because I watched that one too. I haven't actually done my notes on it yet, but I watched it. There's a 2007 Mansfield Park, Pride and Prejudice, all this stuff. So they must have just been doing a whole slew of them all together. And I know it's an artistic choice. That's also the same. I watched the special features because I was curious about this. They made it as a specific choice to make it more exciting. That's why they show the duel. That's why they show the seduction scene. That's also why they made Edward more charming, which I highly disagree with basically all of those decisions. The duel, whatever. That one doesn't actually have that much bearing on the plot. It would have more bearing if someone actually died, but it doesn't. So it doesn't. The other thing I freaked out about is they kept referring to Fanny as Aunt Fanny. She's not their aunt. She's their half-sister-in-law. What? No! The other thing, though, on that head was you can actually pretty explicitly figure out how old their son is. He's about 5 in the book. He's 5. In the movie or the miniseries, they look like they've cast him at more like, I'd say 9 or 10, just based off of, or maybe even older actually, just based off of my younger cousin's kind of development stages and stuff. So that's, maybe they didn't want to have such a young actor or whatever, but too old. Looks like they said it. And this kept yo-yoing. They were sometimes wearing dresses that would have more belonged in the 1790s, and then other times they're wearing stuff that, yes, would have been more 1810s or so. The most glaring example of this, and actually what kind of works a little bit, is where they're at the assembly and they see Fanny there, and Fanny's wearing a very, maybe what they call modern or fashion-forward kind of a dress. So in that case, it works, but where it kind of falls apart a little bit is that you got Eleanor and Marianne kind of going back and forth with the dress styles, which might make sense in some cases, except for the fact that they're getting cut off from having any kind of affluence. Happens early in the novel, but everything happens quite quickly in succession to that. So they would have, before that, probably been fairly well kept up in what they would have considered modern styles. So why you have this flip-flop back and forth between these somewhat subtly distinctive fashion eras is a little bit disconcerting when you actually know to notice it. So it's minor. It is very minor, but yeah. They dropped that John Dashwood had actually resolved to help his stepmother and his stepsisters move from Norland to wherever it was they were going to settle. He was somewhat upset by the fact that he couldn't actually help them because they were moving so far away that it was impractical for him to use any of the vehicles they had there, which I think does miss out a little bit because he's kind of steamrolled by Fanny Dashwood for basically the whole thing, but that does kind of lose you a little bit out on, he's letting himself be manipulated, but he had a better intention than, well, she obviously never did, but he did actually want to try to do more. Eleanor, being kind of the only practical one out of her and her 2 sisters and her mother, is pretty book accurate, which was nice to see. They have Margaret want to be a author, which I should have read. Anyway, but what caught me was Fanny Dashwood talking about how pens and paper are cheap, and they weren't necessarily cheap. I mean, you could get them, and they were probably much more available than they had been previous to that, but they weren't necessarily like what we do now, where you can buy 600, 1,000 sheets for like $4 or something, if that, depending on where you go shopping and if there's a sale or not. I deliberately in my notes described Edward Ferrars in this adaptation as being much more like Henry Crawford, but with better intentions. And I still do kind of stand by that. He is one of the most suave characters, genuinely suave characters in Austen's novels. I'm probably going to have to do a few episodes on him. He's a complicated character. Yay, Mansfield Park, but we're doing Sense and Sensibility. They have pretty blatant allusions to the fact that the china and stuff belongs to the house, but they didn't follow up Fanny's comments about it with the fact that those dishes and things actually belonged to Mary Dashwood. She had them before she had even gotten married, which made her very upset when they went away because she didn't like the fact that they were going to have something so fancy. So there was that. The other thing that kind of ties into that is that Marianne had a pianoforte that she got to take with her from Norland to Barton Cottage. Now, they have a pianoforte at Barton College for Marianne, but it's like the only piece of furniture that comes with the house, which is also wrong because the house was fully furnished. We'll get into that. So they have it there. It's not a very good instrument. At least they have it there. There's other adaptations where they don't have her having a piano at all until it's like gifted to her, this other stuff. But they actually took the piano forte from Norland with them, and that was also something that Fanny was sorry to see go. The other kind of blatant thing, which they took some artistic license with, but within somewhat amount of reason, actually comes back to the setting. I said before that as a movie, it's very well done with this isolating setting kind of thing, just kind of outward expression of how the characters are feeling. But Barton Cottage was in a valley. And there was other towns and stuff around, lots of trees. There's no mention of the ocean anywhere. I did specifically go to look this up because we know they're in Devonshire. There's no mention of any ocean or anything. I'm pretty sure Austen would have mentioned that if there was one. Now, Devon does have two coasts. There's one on the north side, one on the south side. So that is within perhaps some artistic license room, but it's not actually that accurate to the book. The other thing with as far as the fashion is that wearing gloves for outdoors or balls and stuff comes and goes like you wouldn't believe. I really wish they'd be a little more consistent about this stuff. Maybe the actresses just don't like wearing gloves or something. I don't. Why? They have the other characters joking that Colonel Brandon really likes to find fault in other people, and that seems more of a nod to Pride and Prejudice than Sense and Sensibility to me, but whatever. They have some weird hints earlier on in the movie that Marianne is slowly kind of feeling for Colonel Brandon, where it's pretty blatant that she never thought of him in any kind of a romantic way anywhere before, even before meeting Willoughby, so that's kind of why, but I guess they didn't want it to come out of thin air. Willoughby bringing her strawberries is again not accurate. He brought her flowers, he bought her wildflowers, basically right after Colonel Brandon had bought her flowers from a greenhouse, basically. She was more impressed with the wildflowers because of course she was. I was very excited. They had at the balls and stuff, they were doing proper English country or contra dancing. Yay, they did something accurate. Hooray. I also was fussing because she had her hair down almost all the time after meeting Willoughby, which they did occasionally wear their hair down in that time period, but it was usually half up or all up or in a bun or something along those lines. I mean, I've got a ponytail, and if my hair was a little shorter and could curl a little better, then it would be a little closer to what it should look like. I have natural Regency type hair, which is kind of nice, but yeah, I have my doubts that she would have had her hair down that much. Occasionally, yes, but that much? Really? That much? I did find it funny that my Papillon growled every single time Fanny Dashwood came on screen, which was hilarious. They also make it seem like Brandon knows about Willoughby from the very beginning, whereas he saw Marianne's preference in the book and he just kind of quietly backed off himself. He wasn't making all these big overtures and being all suspicious. So Lucy did improve a little bit as the movie went on with her shrewdness, but it never did quite reach the level that I think it starts out with kind of in the book, because you can tell her intentions pretty early on in their meetings. Yeah, overall, most of the characters' portrayals is really well done, except for Edward's. His is the most off. There's subtle ways that Willoughby and Lucy are off a little bit. Even John Dashwood is a little bit off in my opinion, but nowhere near to the degree that Edward is off. This is probably one of the most telling notes that I had made. Movies really don't like stories that take months after the main narrative before they really get going. The other thing they have Marianne do is overhear Willoughby when he's telling Eleanor his story. I guess that's just so they don't have to have a separate scene or indicate that there was another scene where Eleanor told her about all that, but that's how it actually went down in the book. They really like spinning the camera for doing the titles. It's something that I noticed, but yeah. One of the problems that I find a lot with, because it took Marianne a good long time and a very slow build up before she started liking Colonel Brandon in that way. And so they they do this a lot with these things. With the exception of the changing of a couple of the characters and that weird seduction scene at the beginning, the storyline is very close. There's minor details here and there, but most of the adaptation is quite close. I'm just going to tally up my scores here because for some reason I didn't do that. So this movie got all of the points available basically for just a movie in general, which is 30 points, and it got 36 points out of the adaptation points, giving it a total score of 66. I wouldn't necessarily choose this one to watch again just because it is so maddening the way they did change some of the characters. So for me, it was changed in a way that counts kind of against my opinion of it. That may not necessarily be the case with other people. There's probably some people that would like Edward to be a little more engaging or whatever, but so that's that. So it does fall under the category of being a faithful adaptation. I wouldn't necessarily call it the most faithful, though, for obvious reasons. But yeah, so we're doing that, and that's my thoughts on Sense and Sensibility by the BBC of 2007. So thank you for watching. I remain as ever until the next time we meet, the Austen Reviewer. Thank you for joining me. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe for more content, share with your friends to help my channel gain a bit more exposure. I would appreciate it if you would have a look at my Patreon. It's not required by any means, but it does help to support me and just allow me to make more of these videos and put them out on a more regular basis. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time.